Yay.
Welcome to Fairy Tale Flip. I am Vanessa Y. Rogers. I am the hostess of a podcast called Fabric of Folklore. And I don't know if my listeners have probably noticed I'm on a little bit of a hiatus. I haven't put out an interview episodes besides these Fairy Tale Flip episodes, just because I want to focus on some projects that I'm really excited about, just like the project that Donna and I are working on. We'll mention it in just a second, but my co-host is Donna Lee Fields, and she also has a podcast that's also on hiatus, but she runs a website called Scaffolding Magic, which provides education resources for teachers and educators of all different levels. So that's definitely a fantastic resource for educators as well. And her podcast is all about education. And we come together once a month, although we're kind of mid-month right now. We meant to have this episode in April, but my floors, my entire house was upside down because I was having reflooring, and Donna was having things happening at her house. So we just kept pushing it. Now we're in May. So but we're really excited about today's episode. We're going to be talking about the abduction of Persephone. It's the story of romance. Some people, especially contemporary authors, retell it in a romantic way, but it's the story of Persephone and Hades' marriage or abduction. And so Donna, I think, is going to give us a summary of the story, and then we're gonna dive into it.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. You always do such a great job of introducing everything. So thank you about that. And I just want to mention that for people who are seeing this, it's not very hot here. I'm in Mexico, and but it's very cold in the house. So I'm wearing this scarf. So I'm probably going to be playing with it a bit.
Which I'm very jealous of, because we are having like record highs here in Texas. They keep sending out heat advisories, stay inside. We're hitting like the highest recorded temperature in Texas ever this week. So I'm jealous.
Crazy. Okay, but we're both really excited about this episode. This was supposed to be our Easter episode, and as Vanessa says, we got, things happen.
Things happened.
So let me just give a really quick summary of Persephone and Hades. And as Vanessa was saying, some of the conversation, a lot of it actually, is going to be about, what we do, Vanessa and I do, is about subliminal messaging and about looking underneath the belly of the story and finding out what's really going on down there and what the messages are the girls and boys who hear these stories over and over again are really getting. So let me get the summary for those of you who haven't heard Persephone and Hades myth recently. And it's a Greek legend. Hades, who's the god of the underworld, and Vanessa's going to tell us a little bit about the underworld, was abducted he abducted Persephone, who's the daughter of Demeter. She is the goddess of agriculture, fertility, and the harvest, and that's very important in the story. So he abducts her because he fell in love with her and wants to marry her. Persephone is in the field with her companions, collecting flowers, having a beautiful day, and Hades catches sight of her and comes up and kidnaps her, basically. Nobody really knows what's happened. Demeter finds out that her daughter isn't anywhere. She keeps looking for her, and everybody lies to Demeter. No one tells her the truth. Although what's actually happened is Zeus and Hades had a plan. Hades has fallen in love with Persephone. He asks Zeus to marry her. Zeus says, go ahead, but I can't really give you, don't tell Demeter because she won't let you. When Demeter can't find her daughter, she wanders around the earth distraught. Everything on the earth starts dying. Everything turns brown, and there's no harvest anywhere. People start dying. So then Zeus has to say, you know what? We need to negotiate this. All the humans are dying, which for Zeus means nobody is worshiping me. So he sends Hermes down to the underworld. Hermes finds out that in the meantime, Persephone has eaten only 6 pomegranate seeds, sometimes 3, sometimes 9, depending on where in the world the myth is being told. And so in the end, to make a long story short, in the end, Persephone has to live with Hades for 6 months of the year, or 3 or 9, and the other time she spends with her mother. So whenever Persephone is down below in the underworld with Hades, the earth is barren and cold with snow in some parts of the world. And when Persephone is with Demeter, then everything is glorious, is wonderful and glorious, and life is good for the humans. So that's the story in a nutshell. So
Yes.
where do we
Yes.
start, Nessa?
Well, tell me why you like this story.
Well, that's a really interesting question. You always ask me this question, and
Or
I'm
do you like it? Maybe you don't even like it.
well, the interesting thing is I thought about it. I used to love this story, absolutely love it. Why? Because it was a seemingly romantic story about a beautiful girl who is fiercely desired by a man, a powerful man, a king of the land. He takes her, and she sort of pretends not to like him, and then after a while it seems like maybe she does, and so it seems like the perfect romantic story. Now,
Mhm.
as an older woman, as an educator, I realize that this is exactly what is permeating our children's minds. This idea that a capture, a kidnapping, and let's just say a rape can be romantic. It is not romantic at all, and that's what I'd really love to explore in our conversation today, among other things.
Mhm.
And so the question is, do you like it? Did you like it? Has it changed?
Yes, I do like it. It's very jarring when you hear the story originally because, Hades comes out from the earth in his golden chariot and he abducts Persephone and he forcibly takes her down into the earth, which is unpleasant to hear about, right? This is not a story that is a romantic story in especially our contemporary eyes, right? This is a violation. It is a kidnapping. This is so in that aspect I don't, but I really like the different threads, the different themes, and the symbology that we're going to go into behind it. And I think that one of the reasons that this story continues to permeate our modern audiences is because there's a spin on it now. Modern authors are spinning it so that Persephone has more feminine power. She regains her agency and her choice in the retellings, and so there's a lot of that in our spread out in our modern contemporary stories. Um, so that the themes that I really grasped onto was the blending of the love, loss, power, and those eternal cycles of life and with life and death. Um, so I'll just run into love real quick. And we were talking about the romantic love and how a lot of the modern tellings really exemplify the bad boy, the opposite attracts, and they hone in on that beauty and the beast. The Hades is dark and death, and Persephone is light and life, and coming together, the two symbolize a fusion of mortality and renewal, of darkness and light together. And so we see this trope over and over in lots of different stories as well, the bad boy and the good girl, and together they make a better fusion, right? And it also mirrors the cycles of nature and human experience, love, loss and return, separation and reunion. But in the original telling, the focus was really on the motherly love, because Demeter is really driving the narrative in the story. Her profound love for her daughter drives the famine that is happening all across the world, and really forces Zeus's hand to relent and say, oh, well, maybe Persephone can come back. And so I really think that it's interesting how in modern retellings we focus on the romance, but in old tellings and ancient tellings, I think the focus was really on that mother-daughter love.
Well, I think that's really important, Vanessa. I really love how you always see the positive side of a story, and it's interesting that you sort of went to the branch of Beauty and the Beast, because if we're going to go, I completely agree with you. Demeter and Persephone, and that love thread is very important. If we're going to go to love in the underworld between Hades and Persephone, it's really important that we consider. And I'm going to go through a couple of fairy tales that have similar themes, but in the Beauty and the Beast, for instance, it is about love. It's about the girl's love towards this man who is not proud of himself, who's pretty violent, not to her so much, but he's violent in nature. And the message that girls are getting about this is that if you love him enough, he'll turn into a handsome prince. And even if he's angry or dangerous, all you need to do is love him more. And if he doesn't turn into this, charming prince, then it's your fault. And so I'm wondering if we can apply that to Persephone and Hades. Hades doesn't change. There's no transition in his personality in the story. So I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Yes, that is a very interesting point. It is interesting. We were talking a little bit about, we were going to talk a little bit about the underworld and Hades being conflated with the devil. In our Western lens, we often have a Christian lens point, and a lot of people talk about Hades as if he is the same as the devil, but Hades is not the same as the devil at all. He is just the god of the underworld. There are three brothers. Zeus is the god of the heavens, Poseidon is the god of the seas, and Hades is the god of the underworld. And none of them have a morality sticker on them. Just because Hades is under the ground, under the dealing with the dead, does not make him the punisher. He's not a tormentor, as is seen in Christian lenses with the devil. He is, however, very strict and unrelenting, and when people pray to him, it doesn't seem to sway him at all. So he does have the darkness to him because he deals in death all day, and he rarely ever comes up to the light of the earth. But he isn't necessarily bad in his godness, right? He is just, that is just his realm. And so I would say that the darkness, obviously abducting a girl falls in the morality of negative, of evil, but that is the realm of gods, right? All of the gods don't seem to really see that as negative, right? They seem to think that they can do anything that they want, and that is what all of the gods basically do all of the time. There's this really interesting moment that I was going to mention later when talking about Demeter's grief, but it just came up for me. So in Demeter's story, there's a lot in this story that really is about Demeter. So in her grief journey, she ends up becoming a nanny for a mortal family, and she disguises herself as a mortal, so they don't know who she is. But she's just so grief-stricken, she doesn't know what to do with herself, and she's taking care of this young child. And she decides she really loves him, and she wants to make him immortal. And so she starts secretly throwing him in the fire, right? And she's doing this to immortalize him. But at one point, the mother of this baby walks in, and she freaks out, and Demeter has no sympathy for this woman. She's like, I am trying to make your son an immortal. Why do you why are you yelling at me? But of course, this mortal woman had no idea that she was a goddess. She has no idea what Demeter is attempting to do. All she's doing, all she sees is that her child is in the fire. So of course she's going to have that reaction. But even Demeter, who is a mother, doesn't seem to have empathy for this woman. And so I feel like when it comes to the gods, their boundaries of what they can and cannot do, they don't have those boundaries. They just feel like they can do whatever they want. And so all of that to say, I hear what you're saying about women being subliminally given this message, or even consciously given this message, that all you have to do is rough out the edges and help a man become a better man, and then you can have a great romance. You know, I don't know. It's not a story that we definitely want to tell women, that is how you get a man. But I do think there is some truth to it, right? Because bachelors on their own, they can have some rough edges. And so when a woman comes in, it can help balance that the sharpness. I don't know if that answers your question at all. I kind of went off on a tangent.
Oh, shoot. No, it's just that it's what you're saying is almost exactly what the point is that you're, and I don't think you mean to do this consciously, but you're forgiving the man for his sharp edges. And this is what fairy tales and the myths do. I mean, we're supposed to feel sorry for Hades. On the one hand, he didn't have the choice to be the king and the god of the underworld. He was given it because Zeus and Poseidon chose first, and he just took what was left. And he didn't really want the underworld. He was forced to. So right from the beginning, we can feel sorry for Hades for getting, the short straw. But that's no reason to capture a girl and take her to where your hideout is, to where you're living. I know you know that, Vanessa.
And I'm not forgiving him. I'm just saying that it is his expectation, right? What is his expectation of what can he and can he not do? And his expectation is he can do whatever he wants because he's a god.
Right. So our point, what we're doing is show that this is normalized. It's a normalization of the man, not just in the Greek myths because they're gods, but in fairy tales as well. There's a normalization of the men in the fairy tales being being dominant, and the women being the victims. And
yes.
It seems as though that's what's expected. And it's still happening today. Women are getting, in most countries, they're getting paid less in any job they're taking. They're trained to listen to men if they're told to do something that, I know this is going to sound a little generalized, and I know it is, but for instance, I grew up in a household by a pretty liberal woman who made sure that the 3 daughters cleaned the house and our brother could go in his room and listen to music. That's how I grew up, with that sort of mentality is, my job is to be busy all the time. My brother can do whatever he wants. He's sort of walks on water. And that's what the fairy tales also teach us.
Yeah.
I remember I was fascinated by fairy tales, and I grew up sort of inculcated with us this idea that the princess was the victim, that she really didn't have any power, and it was the prince's job to save her. So we see in this Greek myth, the Greek myth we need to acknowledge is not the same as the Grimm's fairy tales and the other fairy tales that we're reading most of the time. But what you and I are doing is to highlight some of the unfortunate subliminal messages that we may be getting so that our listeners can pass on some of these messages.
And I agree with you. And I think in the original telling, the love story is not between Hades and Persephone necessarily. It's primarily through the daughter-mother relationship. I think throughout the story later on in other stories with Hades and Persephone, they do seem to be an actual couple who like each other of sorts. He respects her what she tells him to do. A lot of times people come to Persephone, not Hades, and she is able to direct things that happen in the underworld. So she has an equal power, it seems, in the underworld. But I don't see the ancient story as a love story as much as the retellings of this story as more of the romantic love story.
Okay, so what's really important, what I hear you saying is that the retelling for you is more important, and I completely agree, because we're retelling it in a way where the woman has more power. Yes. Unfortunately, those retellings are not as popular as, say, the Disney versions and the original versions. And the Disney versions are really just sort of color-coded messages, in the same sense that, for instance, let's take Snow White. Let's just take the story of Snow White. Now, in the Disney version, you have this beautiful young girl who is poisoned, and so she's absolutely ageless. And when the prince finally comes to find her, he's captivated by her beauty. Doesn't know anything about her. Doesn't know she has a nice personality. Doesn't know she's healthy. Doesn't know if she's pleasant to be with. All he thinks is, oh, she's beautiful. So in the Disney version, she's also covered by this beautiful glass, protector. And the dwarves in the Disney movie see this powerful prince, and he's wealthy prince. He comes up on this beautiful white horse, and they say, oh, sure, we'll let him go into the glass. We'll open it up for him. And so he forces himself on her, presses his lips to her, and she wakes up. So what is the message the girls are getting? It's okay for a boy to press his lips on my lips. That's okay in society. She doesn't give her consent. She wakes up beautiful and happy. The birds sing. Everybody's, celebrating. That's the message we're getting. So when you're talking about the new telling of Persephone and Hades, that Persephone is just as much power as Hades. In the original version, we don't know that. There are a couple of stories where she does have authority, a couple of them. But for the most part, she is a beautiful girl who is kidnapped because of her beauty and not because of her personality or intelligence or anything like that. And the man has dominated. Zeus, who is a man and the king of the land, the king of the universe, has agreed that she can be kidnapped, basically. So her authority, her agency has been taken away from her. Is she really happy down there? Maybe she's just making the most of it. In the end, she's been kidnapped, and we have to remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you bring up a really interesting point. This is one of the topics that I was going to talk about, is the power dynamics and how much the power dynamics change. And so to start off in the story, the power is held by Zeus and Hades, the gods, right? That is who holds the power. And the women in the story at this point are powerless. Persephone and Demeter both don't have any, they have not even been told what was going to happen. It just happened to them. And so Demeter, whether or not she does it consciously or unconsciously, her grief causes the entire world to go barren. And she, through her grief, starts to force the hand of Zeus. And so in this instance, she becomes the one with the power. And so she's able to come to the table and negotiate, because she has something that Zeus wants, right? If all the humans die, there was no one who can worship him. And so at that point, Demeter has the power. And then Persephone, the stories change depending on if she was tricked in some versions. In some versions, it's her choice to eat the pomegranate seeds. But once she eats the pomegranate seeds, her power dynamic changes as well, because she transitions into the queen of the underworld. Whether or not it's her choice or not, she becomes someone, she moves from maiden to queen and becomes incredibly powerful. She's not as powerful as the men. She's not as powerful as Hades or Zeus, but she definitely gains power in the story. So I really thought that was interesting, how there was that changing of power throughout the story.
Well, I think it's completely valid that you bring up the point that Demeter really did find her power and just, negating her gifts. And that's really important. And I have to go back to the fact that Persephone, you're seeing as she gains power once she's down there, but we can't forget that she was kidnapped. And what I really want our listeners to focus on is that in many of the fairy tales, it's the girl who accepts a position of, quote unquote authority after she's been abused. So let's just go through a couple of fairy tales, and I want your feedback on this. So for instance, in an earlier version, let's just keep for Snow White for a second, and one of the earlier versions by Giambattista Basile, an Italian fairy tale gatherer, the princess is not kept in a glass cage, but rather in a hut. And a king finds her. Now, the king is already married. So not only does he cheat on his wife, he actually rapes the girl in her sleep, impregnates her. She has twins in her sleep. She wakes up while she's giving birth to these twins. The wife, the queen, finds out about this girl, gets one of her servants to take the children and cook them and serve them to the king. The king is furious. He burns his wife, goes to get the girl. She comes into the castle and marries the king, and they live, quote unquote, happily ever after. Now, that happily ever after is what's so bothersome.
Yeah.
The king has committed adultery, has killed his wife, has eaten his own children, and now they're living happily ever after. So tell me how we can, sort of wash that one away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also important to remember that in the times that these were written, it was behaviorally, societally normal. Not that it necessarily should have been acceptable, because it shouldn't have ever been acceptable, but it was something that was seen, and these stories are a way to explore the tension through the societal lens. So we talk about the marriage, right? In our current culture, we see marriage as a union between two loving individuals who want to go on a path together. They want to do life together, right? It is a choice made between two individuals to come together in a loving union. But marriage was not that in the past, right? Marriage was a transfer, a transaction. It was an arrangement between families. It was not romantic. It was just two families coming together and saying, this is how we can better our families. And so this abduction that we see is symbolic of what the Greeks in particular would have seen in their day. And so I don't agree with that element of the story. Obviously, I would not want Snow White to go live with her rapist and have a happily ever after, because I don't think you can have a happily ever after in those instances. But it was a way of exploring and that tension that existed in their societal structure that they saw. And so I think that these stories aren't necessarily, so if maybe when they're I don't know who is writing, they're mostly written by men, right? And so it is normal in the eyes of some of these men for this to happen, but it also is begging the question, not necessarily, I don't know, in the Snow White one, but is this okay, right? Is how do we resolve this in a way that makes this any better? Because we can't go in the past, we can't back up and redo it. So how do we move forward from this? Oh, I can't hear you. I think your mic is off. I can't hear you still.
It's on pause. Okay. Well, the obvious way to get away from, to sort of eliminate the patterns of the past is to do, as you're saying, the retelling. That's one important way to do it. However, as I mentioned before, the retellings are not as popular as the old versions, and mostly because the old versions are reflecting what's still going on in the world. There is still abuse. There is still rape. There is still dominance of men over women. And what we need to do is exactly what you and I are doing, is to highlight these points so that even if children are reading the old versions, they're getting the different messages. So for instance, in Waldorf schools, storytelling is the basis of their education. And a lot of people think, and they're reading the Grimm's versions. And a lot of people will say, well, how can you read the Grimm's versions, which are bloody and gory and very, they show all the abuse to the little children. And then Waldorf teachers will say, we're prepared for that because we're going to read it and then we talk about it afterwards. So one of our missions, you and I, is that we're talking about the abuse. And I agree with what you're saying, and yet the fairy tales are filled with the dominance of men, and we need to look at it. You and I explored Rumpelstiltskin. So, what do you remember about our discussion of Rumpelstiltskin? It was involved. How can I have made a certain connection between Rumpelstiltskin and Persephone and Hades? Do you see the connection?
Oh, well, yes. Because the princess ends up marrying her captor, right? He forces her to uh what is it? Spin hay into gold, and then he marries her after threatening her life. And so yes, that union is not going to be a happy one necessarily.
Right, but in
And
the
it's
end,
based upon a violent action. I don't know if he ever actually was violent towards her, but the emotional and verbal abuse was there.
So first she's threatened by her father. She has to marry the king. She has to. So she's abused by her father. Then she's abused by the king because he wants more gold, you know, woven into thread. And then she's abused by this little magical creature. And so she's abused from all angles. And the king, yes, he abuses her. He tells her, "I'm going to kill you if you don't weave more straw into thread, into gold." And the Rumpelstiltskin threatens her baby. I mean, she's threatened from all sides. And in the end, she's happy with the king after being threatened for most of her life. We need to really look at that.
Yeah.
So in retelling, of course, in retelling, the girl is actually the heroine and she saves Rumpelstiltskin and they have a child together. But still, they have a child together in the retelling and she's happy with Rumpelstiltskin in the retelling. And yet she was abused by Rumpelstiltskin. So I'm getting very emotional about this because I want us to remember that
Yeah.
the happily ever after is written there by men who rewrote these stories and
Yeah.
took them down.
But I do think that it is important to note that these stories, like for instance, Demeter's grief and her rage, it created a space to have this critique of the abduction, of her lack of consent. And it was in part a way for the ancient Greeks to explore the tension and resolve it in a way that upheld their existing social order. So the marriage held because that was the agreement that was already agreed upon between Zeus and Hades, but there was a compromise. She was allowed to be with her mother for half of the year during the springtime and had to go back into the underworld in the fall. And so it was a way, in some ways it was a way to explore this common practice that was not necessary. It was not something that mothers and daughters wanted to endure, and yet they had to.
And yet they had to. So I'm coming back to it again. She's basically in prison for part of her life in the underworld because, in my view, she doesn't have a choice. Zeus has ordered her that she has to spend part of their time in the underworld, and so that's just showing girls that you do what you're told and you accept it. All right, I've made my point. You understand it. We both
Yeah.
understand this. But there's something interesting because I read about the underworld. You have some things, and then there's sort of symbolism about the underworld that I really liked. That she is sort of because I did want to say, now the modern depictions of Hades, the images. If you do a Google search for images and look for Hades, he's now this sort of romantically dark figure, and that's what we want to really look at. Is he, or is he just a kidnapper? Anyway, you make the decision. But there is symbolism about the dark. We do need dark places because in the dark, that's where the seeds grow. And in the dark, that's where we can sleep and regenerate. So that's one way of looking at this. Darkness is good for us. The balance between light and darkness is also something that I can sort of get on board with a little bit, if that's your
Yeah.
choice.
Okay, so talking about that, this is a story that a lot of trauma survivors really gravitate towards. And there's the reason that this is a story that they feel echoes their own experience is that internal duality. there's several elements, but I'm going to get to what you were just saying. There's the split existence of Persephone's life that is divided between her two worlds, right? She's the goddess of the underworld, and also she's the goddess of spring and fertility. On the surface, her public self, she's appearing joyful and strong, but in the underworld, her private self, she's carrying pain and grief. So this double life really resonates with people who've experienced trouble, they feel the need to mask their pain and present a composed exterior to the outside world. And so I don't know if you came across the terminology shadow work, but I believe Carl Jung is the one who coined the term. At least I keep finding quotes when I look up shadow work about from Carl Jung, and he says, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And so, those wounded parts of yourself, where you hold the pain, the grief, the rage, that are part of your psyche, and when you hide those wounded parts, it holds you back. So in shadow work, it's embracing that darkness and bringing it to the light so that both your light and darkness can come together and heal and integrate into a whole person. And so basically, shadow work is for anyone who dares to ask the question, what am I hiding from myself? And so a lot of people see this story of Persephone having this dual existence between the underworld and the earth as being a story that they really resonate with and can use to explore their own grief. And I don't know, I think I mentioned her on our podcast before, Sabrina Fletcher. I believe the episode was 39, and she helps women who have to have a medical abortion because of a medical reason, and she holds grief circles for that specific group, and she uses the story of Persephone, Demeter, and Hades to explore that grief as well. And so I see it as a tool to talk through these strong emotions.
Interesting, because you're sort of reminding me that part of what's going on, went on in the past. I don't know if they're still doing the Illusion Mysteries. Did you research that at all?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
the Illusion Mysteries, it's actually, it was so secret, experts still don't know what was actually done in the rituals, but it was
Mm-hmm.
celebrating the rejuvenation of life, and it
Yeah.
was the sort of undertone was that Persephone willingly goes to the underworld because it's a really important time of rest and rejuvenation for the land, for the people. And so it was sort of a manifestation of that dynamic that we
Mm-hmm.
experience on Earth. What have you researched on the Illusion Mysteries?
I mean, I watched a couple of videos about the Illusion Mysteries, but like you said, there's so much mystery behind it because
Right.
there wasn't a whole lot recorded. Just that Demeter and Persephone were at the head of it, and there were a lot of sacred ceremonies around it, and that it guided the souls into an eternal life of um, joy, basically. And there used to be a lot of festivals that were a part of it as well. And I think just they don't have as I don't know if there are any. I think there are a few still that happen, but they used to be much more widespread, and now they don't exist as much. But there are people. At one point, we were talking about how the Greek mythology is not really worshipped anymore, and I came across some people who actually do work in that, and they have spiritual beliefs in the Greek mythology. So I didn't do a deep dive into that, but I wanted to correct myself that there are still people who use the Greek mythology for spiritual practices.
Okay, and I'm going to go somewhere there because you know that I believe in my spirituality goes into life on other planets and that sort of thing. And so if you're into life on other planets and a completely different history of the world than what we're told in school, is that the original terrestrials, I would say, or they're not terrestrials because they came off Earth, the original people who lived on the Earth were actually the Greek gods. In other words, the Greek gods are based on the original people who populated the earth and who sort of set up the system that we now live under. So when people are still worshiping the Greek gods, I think, and it's very possible that what they're doing is worshiping the actual beings from other planets who came down on Earth and set up the system that we now know of. I know that sounds very out there, but so let me save myself a little bit, although I'm not embarrassed about it at all. I think we need to really widen our minds and think about so many other possibilities than what we are taught in school or in the media, because it's just too limiting. So you and I were saying that we both researched a little bit the symbolism of the pomegranate, and that's really important because the pomegranate, some say, those who say that Persephone willingly went down to Hades, they also say that she willingly and knowingly ate the pomegranate because the pomegranate is a symbol of fertility in almost every culture. And so she purposefully ate the pomegranate seed so that she would have to stay in the underworld, at least for a certain amount of time, and that it would bring her a sort of fertility and prosperity in her relationship. What do you have about the pomegranate?
I didn't do a whole lot of research on it, but I did find that the seed symbolizes, and there were so many different things the pomegranate seed could symbolize. So that's why I didn't do a deep dive into it. But the seeds symbolize a marital contract and the irreversibility of certain choices. So once you make a choice, you're set on a path and you can't go backwards. You can choose another path, such as like marriage or adulthood. All these different things that we choose leads us in certain directions, and eating the pomegranates were a choice, basically. That is
right.
That's
and what we need to understand, for some reason I need to research this a little more, is when you eat anywhere, eating is apparent. You're ingesting something. It's energy. You're ingesting energy from one source into yourself. And so in Greek myths and other places as well, eating something is a compromise. You are actually you're promising a certain part of yourself with that energy. It is now part of you. And so it didn't have to be the pomegranates, although that's why pomegranates have always been fascinating for me from this myth. But, they are, and if you look at it, if you cut open a pomegranate, it's very sensual, and it looks like parts
ovary.
of a woman's body. So
yeah, I think it looks like ovaries.
Very much so, and fruit and vegetables are mirrored on the human body, or vice versa. So it makes a lot of sense.
So
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wanted to talk a little bit about eating in another realm, like you were talking about, but did you have another point?
No. Let's keep going with this, and then I just want to add another point about princesses.
So that really struck a chord with me, because if you remember, we did a story around Halloween about the girl who danced with fairies. And in fairy mythology, if you eat the food offered to you by the fairies, you are stuck in their world. And so I saw the parallel between this story with Persephone eating pomegranate seeds and the human girl eating fairy food. And so I was curious if this was in other mythologies, and it is. It's across mythologies globally. It's found in Celtic mythology, Mesopotamian mythology, obviously the Greek mythology, even in Japan. So we find this motif that warns against violating boundaries, and it represents the transformative and irreversibility of nature when you make a certain choice. So it is a moral lesson in a way to prevent people's curiosity, so that you don't violate boundaries. And once you accept the food that is given to you, it implies either submission or indebtedness to those who are giving it to you. And
Makes a
it's
lot of sense. Yeah.
the eating from another realm, like you said, the energy, it alters your essence. It makes you part of that world. There is a story about a Japanese story, Tofu Kozo. I don't know how to say it properly. She's a spirit that offers tofu to humans, and when you eat it, it either causes illness or misfortune, or it can bind you to the spirit world. And so it's very interesting how this concept of eating food in the world that you are not from can really connect you and keep you uh, in that place.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, Vanessa. Thank you so much for finding that and sharing that, because I am a deep believer, and the whole cliche of you are what you eat is so true if you really see food as energy. And I say prayers every morning. I used to say before every meal, and then I was too hungry. I just wanted to eat. But I say prayers every morning to the food around me, for thanking it for merging with my life energy, because it is life, it is energy that is merging with my energy. And it's really important for us. I think this is another great lesson that you and I can share with our listeners. It's really important that the girls and boys listening to these stories see this as a lesson. It's really important to think about what we're putting in our mouths. And you go and get all sorts of manifestations of sugar and put it into your body. It is going to affect you. These restaurants that are so popular have really tasty foods. Why? Every time I taste something that's incredibly tasty that I didn't make, I know there's probably sugar in it, or a lot of oil, and probably a lot of other processing that shouldn't be in my body. A long way, excuse me for going on and off of this, but a long way of saying it's a great way of explaining to our listeners and our readers. Persephone ate some pomegranates. She either did it knowingly or unknowingly. That had huge consequences for it, just as whatever we put into our bodies have consequences, either positive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So,
Another, go ahead.
no, please.
I was just going to say that another thing that I really wanted to touch on real quick is the mythic memory. And this is not something that a lot of people have talked about, but I started researching it because it made me curious when Demeter goes for months and months, because Persephone is down there for quite a long time. And the world becomes so barren, and there's a great famine that hits the earth, and she's kind of just hiding out, and it's the worst that the world has ever seen. And it made me wonder, is this a story that's really ruminating on a past event that could have actually occurred, that they're building it into that story? And we see this time and time again. One of the most common stories that people are familiar with is Noah's Ark, the catastrophic floods. Noah's Ark is not just found in the Bible, it's found in Gilgamesh and many other traditions across mythologies. And it is believed that there was a flood that occurred that really wiped out much of the earth, or at least a good portion of the people who were telling the stories. And it is not, these myths aren't necessarily literally true, but they are encoded with truth that the people of the time felt was important to pass on to future generations. And so there was a time period, it was a potential climate crisis that happened during the Younger Dryas period, which occurred 12,900 years ago to 11,000 years ago, near the last ice age, when there was a period of warming, and there was a return, a sudden return to near glacial, much colder conditions that affected the northern hemisphere. That is potentially a time period, an event that this story could have been recording.
I love that, Vanessa. I think that's really, really important. And we have talked about other fairy tales where there is mythic memory. Is that what you're calling it?
Yeah, mythic
Yeah,
memory.
I love it. I think it's absolutely true. It's about society talking about itself and
Yes.
the memory, the history. So what I would love to do is, what we usually do is sort of wrap up what our favorite themes in this tale are or the message that we want to give. And if you would permit me, what I would like to share is the message that I think is the most important in this story. And that is, it's the importance of respecting boundaries and respecting the autonomy of others, because I feel that that was not given to Persephone, and except in the retellings, and it's really important that we share that with our students, our children. And it reminds us that every action has a ripple effect. So Hades decided that he wanted something, didn't give the other person permission to decide, and that had an effect of, sort of raising the earth, and it was only fixed because Zeus, as I was saying before, was sort of missed being worshipped. And what I think is also really important, I used to wonder why these little books the princess books, where you take out a princess and you clothe her, and the rest of the pages are just all frilly pink things that you put on the princess. I didn't realize why that bothered me to the core. And a lot of it is because, as I was doing the research for this program, for this session between you and me, Disney has found such a market. It is one of the largest growing markets in the world, the princess market. And that's to show how if you're beautiful and you have pretty clothes, and if you're promised pretty clothes and being taken care of by having more pretty clothes, then you need to take any abuse or disrespect and go for it. So I know that sounds very dramatic, but it's so true in so many of these fairy tales. So that's the message I would like to propagate in this session, is that please help our little girls and little boys realize that just the superficial, the beauty is not what we need to go for, and asking permission to touch and to sort of involve ourselves in someone else's life is the world we want. How's that?
Yeah. Oh, well, I think I don't know if you've seen any modern Disney movies, but Moana, Raya, what's the other? Tangled. There's a lot of retellings of stories that are very female empowering. So I think that they have moved away from that. Although your point is very well taken. The classics are still there, and they're still integral to the Disney storytelling. I did want to talk a little bit about the history, because there was an older tale that this tale is believed to be based off of. Did you find that?
I didn't look for that. I was so wrapped up in the whole rape of
So it's a Sumerian tale, and its earliest texts date back to 1900, 1600 BC to 1600 BC, which would be about 3,800 years old. And it's called Inanna's Descent. And so basically what happens is there are two goddesses. One is Inanna, she's the goddess of the heavens, and then her sister, Ereshkigal, is the queen of the underworld. But she's only the queen of the underworld because she's kidnapped by a primeval dragon who forces her down into the underworld, and she becomes the ruler of the underworld against her will. So that's that connection. And then the next connection, the seasonal changes of Persephone, that's tied to the story, is a little bit more convoluted. But Inanna, the queen of the heavens, decides to come down to visit her sister. It seems that she's kind of trying to usurp her sister. It's a little unclear, but Ereshkigal is not having it. She does not want her sister taking her throne, and so she requires her sister to strip her of all of her clothing, as she's passing through the 7 gates to the underworld. And then she has her sister murdered. And then her sister is revived, and the deal that is struck that is that in order for Inanna to be able to go back to the heavens, she has to have a substitute in her place. And so she searches for someone to be the substitute, and she learns that her lover is not mourning her. He's not wearing mourning clothing. He's still having a good time. So she chooses her lover to be the substitute in the underworld while she goes back into the heavens. But another deal is struck, and he's allowed to come up into Earth, and for half of the year. So while he is gone, while he is absent, that is when grain is stored underground. While he's under the earth, everything is dormant. And when he returns to the heavens is when you plant and harvest. And so that element of the story also ties in nicely with the explanation of how the seasons were created, right? Because I don't even know if we mentioned that the whole concept of this story it's an explanation of how the seasons came to be.
We talked about it a little bit, but I know you wanted to share a lot of information about the symbolism of seasons. Let's try to find another fairy tale where we can use all that information and talk about it another time, because we're almost to our limit. So
Yes.
if you wouldn't mind, tell me what your closing message is about this story.
Well, I do like that there's a cultural. We in our own contemporary viewpoint have a cultural shift from the time period of when the Greeks wrote this, and I like that there's a lot of stories that are being written that really change the elements that we don't like the lack of consent, the desire for agency, the empowerment, and the giving of her own identity that's not necessarily connected to Hades. And so I like that this story is being retold to empower Persephone in ways that we want to see for our own daughters and for ourselves. And I think that that element is why the story continues to be told, because although the start of the Greek myth is very disturbing, we can retell it in ways that are empowering for future generations.
Ooh, nice one. Okay. Very nice. Okay, so um, you do the ending. You always do the ending so well, Vanessa. How would you like to lead our listeners to our next
So,
step?
we had talked about what we're going to do for next month. What did we decide was our next story that we're going to be diving into?
Did we? I think we decided, but it's buried in a lot of messages we sent back
Okay.
and forth.
Well, we have a story that we've picked out, and we will be coming back with you. It's a great one. We were both excited about it, and we're still deep in the making of our journal that explores all many of these stories that we've been talking about. And down in the link of both of our podcasts, you will be able to find a free example. And if you download it, you can come back to us and tell us what you like and what you don't like, so that when we have the final copy of the journal, you will have a say in the structure of this daily journal that we are creating for our fairy tale flip audience members. So we're really excited about that
So
project. And
excited.
so definitely get the link down below and let us know what your thoughts are and how we can structure it so that it works best for you. So thanks so much for joining us on this fairy tale flip episode. Until next time, keep the fairy tales alive.
Thank you. Bye.